Robert Morgenthau and Lucinda Franks are here. They have been one of New York's most famous couples for close to 4 decades, 40 years. He served as Manhattan's district attorney, stepping down in 2009 after 35 years. Many credit him for making that office the #1 in the nation. She's a journalist who at age 24 became the youngest woman to win the Pulitzer Prize and the first woman to win for national reporting. Her new book is called Timeless Love, Morgenthau and Me. It tells the story of their marriage. I am pleased to have them back at this table. Welcome.
Great
to see both of you. So tell me about the book. Why do you decided to put this story in a book?
You know, people know Bob as a brilliant prosecutor. He's been called the DA of the world.
Right.
But they know a kind of reserved, stiff person that will not, reveal his real self.
Right.
I wanted him to go down in history as a rounded person.
Right.
I wanted to do a portrait in all his complexity that people didn't know. At the same time, I wanted to save my marriage. My marriage was more important in the book, so it was a very...
Now, how does this save your marriage?
Well, in the sense that I didn't want to be so honest,
you drew a line.
So many foibles revealed that it would affect my marriage, because my marriage was more important than this book.
When did you know that this woman, you were 50-something, 53 when you got married?
56, I think
50,
it was.
She was about 20 what?
26, something
26,
like that.
something like that. So she's in her 20s, you're in her 50s. What attracted you to her?
Well, the first time I met her, she was doing a piece on contributors to the Nixon campaign, and particularly Maurice Stans.
Yes.
And
he was, I think, the finance chairman of the committee to re-elect.
Right. And then subsequently the Secretary of Commerce.
Right.
But anyway, she came in, and I thought she was wearing an Indian rug. It turned out it was much more sophisticated than that, but she caught my attention. I first refused to be interviewed by her, but then I relented. And she asked me a lot of good questions, but she was incredibly persistent,
right,
which women reporters in those days were not. How do I spell names and so forth? And when she left, I said, this is either the dumbest reporter I've ever met or the smartest. And after I read the piece, I said, no, she's the smartest reporter.
Yeah.
But I didn't have the courage to ask her.
But when you started dating, I mean, your friends were not thrilled about this, were they?
Well, it was a little bit like the Pope asking Squeaky Fromme for her hand in marriage. That was the shock. Among all of his extended family, among my radical friends who dropped me.
Yeah. It's fair enough to say, I mean, what you were, I mean, you had written and had gotten to know some of the members of the most radical organizations in the 60s.
Yes, I was pretty much part of that
and sort
world.
of thought of yourself in terms of a lot of their objectives at one with them.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Not all of them, but certainly some of them. And then here's this guy who's the, comes from one of America's most best-known families.
It was an oxymoron.
Yeah.
I mean, he was dedicated to upholding the law. And I was dedicated to breaking it. I mean, but he had this magnificent forehead. And I just thought he was so smart and so interesting. But then I walked out and said, well, I'm not going to see him anymore. He's the establishment. But I did see him more, and he finally got...
You tell the story in here of I guess, a dinner party given by Arthur Schlesinger or someone. And the two of you saw each other there, or did you go together?
Bob finally got the nerve. He was my source.
Right.
He finally got the nerve to ask me out on a date.
Right.
He said, we're going to Arthur Schlesinger's house for a party for Jimmy Carter.
Right.
I dressed up in my best bell-bottoms, my peasant blouse, my platform shoes. I walked in, and there was this ghastly fairyland. of satin and sequins and feather boas wrapped around swan-thin necks.
Yeah.
And they looked at me like I was homeless. But Jackie Kennedy came in, and these society ladies dropped their jaws and just were smiling at her and smiling at her. And I looked at Bob, and he was smiling too, but not at Jackie.
At you.
At me.
Yeah. So you knew.
There was that, oh, my God.
Yeah.
Oh, my God. Have I misinterpreted this one?
In the prelude to the book, Lucinda, you write to him, "Every day you're making history while I make nothing. I'm a Lilliputian standing in the shadow of a giant. Your success seems to make mine unnecessary, unwise even. What if I began to write again and failed, or worse, succeeded? What if I jumped you on your pedestal and then, God forbid, knocked you off? We've already disturbed the balance of nature. How far can we tempt fate?" That's pretty good, huh?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
It was true. I mean, you know, my friends dropped me. His family, his extended family, told him to see a psychiatrist. They wouldn't speak to him. I mean, it was really, we were like Romeo and Juliet, a hoarier version, but there was just only us. There was just the two of us.
So you, in other words, you had to depend on each other.
Yes, yes.
One of the reviewers, I think this was Maura Hodgson in the Wall Street Journal, said, "Her life was dedicated to the service of her husband. If anything, she now appears more worshipful of Mr. Morgenthau than ever, and Timeless is a long love letter to him."
That is not true.
Not which part?
That, well,
All
it
of it?
is not about worshiping my husband. It's about a relationship between two people that have, you know,
From very different places.
From very different places.
Different ages.
3 decades different, who have, you know, really serious careers. And it's how we interacted and how we were, you know, reconciled to certain differences in each other. And I think this love letter bit is, as kind as that might be from a reviewer, is just not the book.
Here's what one critic says, and no more than one. I've sent several of this, and this is sort of goes with the territory of writing a book, if you write a memoir. It's called TMI, too much information.
Too much information.
In other words, they're saying, you just gave us too many facts.
Yeah.
We didn't want to know everything you told us.
Right. And I walked into a book club group once, and one of the first things somebody said was, you know, your characters were too real. I mean, I didn't want them that real. And so, you know, too much information, I don't know what that means. I just sat down and I wrote the book, and I swallowed my pride. I swallowed Bob's pride, and it came out. And I'm sorry, if there's too much information, then just don't read it. Skip around.
You also were a federal, you were 2nd District U.S. Attorney.
Right.
U.S. Attorney for the 2nd District, I think. Is that right?
Southern District.
Southern District, right. Southern District. Was that job more interesting, less interesting than Manhattan DA?
Well, they were different. I mean, the Southern District...
That was you were appointed by President Kennedy.
Yeah, and reappointed by President Johnson.
Right.
But, I mean, the Southern District handled 1,000 cases a year. The district attorney handled over 100,000 cases, so it was like a boutique in a supermarket. The client in most of those Southern District cases was the United States, and it was a fascinating job. But you had a report, you had a boss in the Attorney General's office, and you couldn't testify without their permission. Whereas the DA's office, you were much closer to the victims of crime, and you had no boss except the voters.
Which job? The
DA.
Yeah. That job for the U.S. Attorney was held by Rudy Giuliani?
Yes.
All right. It was held now by Preet Bharara?
Right.
who just announced some really remarkable prosecutions.
Right.
Are you, by definition, a prosecutor rather than a defense attorney? Are you more interested in taking the power of the law and making sure that people who violate the law...
Well, I want to be sure that the law is observed. I mean, I've been working now for the last year on a death penalty case in Alabama, where there's a man who's been on death row for 27 years, and he's absolutely innocent. And the people in Alabama, the prosecutor, did not turn over grand jury minutes, police interviews in violation of Brady versus Maryland. And I'm trying to get this guy a new trial.
So you like that?
I mean, I want to see justice done.
Right.
Wherever the scales fall.
But back to the difference between the 2nd District and the Manhattan DA. My guess is you like the Manhattan DA more, A, because, you know, you were really, your job was determined by the voters.
Right.
It was an elective office.
Right.
While the other one was an appointive office as U.S. Attorney.
Yeah.
And there were more wider variety, and it's closer to the street, I think.
Right. And, you know, you deal with, you know, real victims of crime, individuals, whereas Southern District, you're generally dealing with government victims. I mean, they're both great jobs.
Now, what was your relationship to Bernie Goetz?
I prosecuted him, and that was a very unpopular prosecution.
Tell us who he was.
Well, he was the guy that went on a subway train and shot 4 people.
Yeah.
And when we first presented the grand jury, we didn't get any indictment. And I had to represent it and get a second shot, got an indictment. The defense said, you know, you can't represent. The judge agreed, dismissed the indictment. I took an appeal, and we prevailed. But we didn't convict him of attempted murder. We were only convicted of possession of a gun. I mean, Bernie Goetz was a folk hero at that point.
Well, because the 4 young men were African American, he said he thought he was going to be robbed. They said they were just panhandling him, and the crime was up, you know, very high. So people thought, well, you know, more power to him to stop this kind of crime.
The most interesting one for me, Bob, is the one that involved Nasser for the murder of Rabbi Meir Kahane.
Right.
You know, because you believe that if there would have been more discovery,
right,
you might have found some evidence linking him to people who were involved in 9/11.
I don't think there's any question of that. But the PD turned over all the records in Nasser's apartment to the FBI, and they held on to them, and they had nobody who could translate them. They had no Arabic-speaking people. I lent them eventually somebody from my staff to translate them, and it was clear. I mean, there were pictures of World Trade Center and Grand Central Station and so forth. These are monuments which must be destroyed. And I think if we'd had that earlier and had followed up on it, we might have stopped 9/11. The other big mistake that the government made was, you know, we had air marshals on all the planes, and then for a couple of years, and then they took them all off. If there'd been air marshals on those planes, I don't think the 9/11 could have occurred.
What's your favorite case?
Oh, I didn't have any favorite case. I mean, what I always told people on staff was that every case is important to the victim. There's no such thing as an unimportant case. So I guess the cases that I thought were the most interesting was where we pushed the envelope. People said we couldn't. I mean, like pursuing BCCI, which was chartered in Luxembourg,
right,
and then BCCI overseas in the Grand Caymans, and offices in 70 countries.
Tell me what you thought about the Strauss-Kahn case.
Well, the victim told three totally different stories. And when a prosecutor puts a victim on the stand, you're vouching for their truthfulness. And if you don't know which story she's going to tell, you can't vouch for her truthfulness. So I thought that Cy, and I told him this, was absolutely right in dismissing the charges.
But should they have ever brought it the way they did? Should they have pulled him off that plane like they did? Was he a candidate to flee because he was a distinguished head of the IMF?
I mean, if I had been DA, I would have hoped he fled if the case was a pain in the neck. And,
so you would not have wanted him pulled off the plane?
well, I don't know all the facts, but I think that in retrospect, it probably was a mistake. I mean, you make them put up the bail, and if they flee, you say God bless them, because you know they're not going to come back and commit that crime in the country. And the amount of resources that go into a case like that huge and distract.
But do you think Cy handled it about right?
I do. I do.
Remind us about your father, who you found out is almost like letters in the attic.
It was. It really was. One day, I was helping clean out my father's things, which were a mess. He was 80 years old, and I lifted out my mother's old nightgowns. She had passed away, and there was a Nazi uniform. And I took it out. I looked at it, and I said, "Daddy, what is this?" And he said, "Oh, it's something your mother was supposed to get rid of. You know, I don't want to talk about it." That set me on a quest so that I would not let him not tell me what he had done during the war that he had to wear a Nazi uniform for. So it unfolded, you know, very quickly that he had been a spy during World War II. He had been deep undercover. He had been an assassin of Nazi officers, all of which blew my mind because my father and I had been somewhat estranged because he never wanted anybody to ask him anything about what he had done during the war. He had taken an oath of silence. And this brought us together. It was sort of resurrected that relationship we had when I was a child, and he was just the most wonderful man in the world who taught me everything. So we had that for the last few years of his life. We had a reconciliation, and we had, you know, falling in love with each other all over again.
And did he tell you about, at that point, had he lost some of the inhibition to tell you everything?
Yes. I think there was a time when he forgot that he was supposed to forget. He forgot that he had taken an oath of silence. He had liberated a Holocaust camp.
One of the early ones.
One of the first ones, well, the first one discovered by the Allies. And, you know, he testified at Bob's Museum about that. But he never would talk about it. He never was the same because of it. And right up until he told me about it, he thought that he had taken an oath of silence never to speak about it because that's what they told soldiers right after the war when they had discovered these camps.
How well did you know Jack Kennedy?
Pretty well. I mean, I wasn't one of his intimates. I knew him when we sailed against each other up there in Cape Cod, and I knew him when he was in the Senate, and I supported him when he ran, but I was not an intimate of his.
You owned a destroyer in World War II.
Right.
You owned destroyers that were torpedoed in World War II.
Right.
How did you survive?
Luck.
Luck.
You had to be lucky. You know, the second destroyer I was on was torpedoed and sunk off Algiers.
Yeah.
Taking a convoy in support of the Anzio landings. And then
in Italy.
In Italy, yeah. And then I went to a new destroyer and went out to time for Iwo Jima in Okinawa. And on April 6th, which was the first big attack, April 6, 45, we caught a torpedo through the bow. We know it was a torpedo. It didn't detonate. We knew it was a torpedo because we found the propeller, called the impeller of the torpedo, inside the ship. And we were very lucky because it would have blown the bow off the ship. And we tried to reach our squadron commander to tell him that we were on the picket station 15, which was the one nearest to Japan, north of Ishima. And couldn't reach him, but the task force commander, Richmond Kelly Turner, whose code name was Anzac, came on and said, "What's your message, Bauer?" And we told him, he said, "Don't wait to be relieved. Proceed at your best possible speed to your base." So we left just ahead. There were 800 planes came in that day. It was the biggest attack of the Pacific War.
This was the invasion of Iwo Jima.
Yeah.
Right.
And anyway, the ship that relieved us got absolutely clobbered, the Newcomb. So we were doubly lucky. We didn't lose that bow.
And Bob had to watch, one by one, all of his men, he was executive officer, drown. He gave his life belt away. He gave his life jacket away. He tried to save as many as he could, but he just had to watch them go down into the sea. And that, to me, is courage.
You know, why did they go down and you didn't?
I was about a swimmer, I think.
Your grandfather was U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of Treasurer, he was your father.
Right.
And what influence did he have on you?
Well, he was a great believer in public service. And also, you know, when I volunteered to go in the Navy early on, I mean, my mother wasn't too happy, but he encouraged me.
He did?
Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
Right.
Thank you, Lucinda.
Thank you so much.
The book is called Timeless, Love, Morgenthau, and Me.